All right, so check this out. This shot was completely unusable before. Grainy, noisy, lacking a lot of detail, but check out what the DaVinci Resolve noise reduction tools can do. Even on this shot with only slight noise, we can clean it up in no time and we still get real-time playback. With other tools that take a whole lot of processing power, we probably wouldn't even bother to denoise this shot. But with DaVinci Resolve, we have the power and flexibility to use this tool. I feel like a lot of Resolve users, including myself, severely underutilize the noise reduction tools. I think this is because the sliders are a little bit counterintuitive, or we're kind of just stuck in the way that we've always done it. But underneath this tool is actually an incredibly powerful algorithm that can detect motion and separate that from the noise that you're trying to reduce. This tool is GPU accelerated, taking full advantage of your system, and while it's fast, it also yields incredibly clean results on your footage. Hey, what's up? My name is Evan Schneider, and I'm a professional colorist, and in today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into the DaVinci Resolve noise reduction tools. I'm going to walk you through every single control in the noise reduction palette. I'm also going to apply these tools to some footage to show you how they work in real-world scenarios. Now, the goal of noise reduction is actually not to completely and utterly remove every trace of noise in your footage, because this often results in shots that look plasticky or smudgy or fake. Then you end up trying to sharpen it afterwards and you get crazy looking edges, and you end up with a very unnatural looking image. My goal with these tools is always to be very gentle with the footage and only remove distracting noise. The other thing you can do with these tools is to completely clean up the footage in order to add a more pleasing grain at the end of the pipeline. So one thing I should note is that the noise reduction tools in Resolve are only available in the studio version. So unfortunately, if you're using the free version of Resolve, you'll have to upgrade to the studio version in order to use these tools. But I actually think that that is a great reason to upgrade, especially if you're planning on doing a lot of noise reduction, because the tools in Resolve are faster and much better than a lot of the plugins you'll find like Neat Video or After Effects. Plus, then you don't have to do a round trip, which is always extremely convenient. Also, I think even if you don't do a lot of denoising before, I think you'll end up actually using this tool more than you expect to. So there's two ways to actually access the noise reduction tools in Resolve. The first way is to access them through the effects panel, and I'm just going to search for noise reduction, and you can click here and you can just drag it onto your node pipeline and it'll create a new node with the effect applied. While you can do this, I actually prefer a different method. So I'm going to delete this node and close my effects panel, and you can actually access the tool on the motion effects palette down here. And if you click this icon, you can see we have Temporal NR, Spatial NR, and Motion Blur. So I'm going to explain the motion effects palette in just a minute, but the first thing I need to explain is actually where in the pipeline to put your noise reduction node. And I almost always place the noise reduction node as the first node in the pipeline. Technically, you can place it anywhere, and some colorists prefer to place the noise reduction in a node directly after some primary adjustments. Other people like to place the noise reduction at the end of the node tree. However, I place it as the very first node for a few reasons. First, it means that I'm feeding it the original camera data without any manipulations or adjustments. The second reason is that by placing it at the beginning of my node tree, I'm ensuring that I'm feeding the rest of my color grade of a clean image. That means if I apply any LUTs or if I make any qualifications or curves adjustments, I'm not adding to the digital noise or making it harder to remove by placing it at the end of the node tree. The third reason is that I can always take advantage of Resolve's render cache. This means that I can tell Resolve to automatically render this node in the background while I work, which enables me to come back to real-time playback. And if I add any nodes after the noise reduction and change them, it won't affect the render cache on the noise reduction. If I add the node in the middle of the node tree or the end and then adjust a node before the noise reduction node, that means the noise reduction node is going to have to re-render every single time I make an adjustment. So I'm going to use this first clip as an example, and you'll see here that I already have a color correction node on here. This just includes a conversion LUT for my footage and a basic correction. But if I turn this off, you can see the original F-Log footage. I feel like this clip is a good example of showing how the noise reduction tools work. So down here in the motion effects palette, you'll see that we have 3 columns. First column is temporal NR, next column is spatial NR, and then finally we have motion blur. We're not going to be looking at the motion blur column, so we're only going to be looking at the temporal NR and the spatial NR. The temporal NR and spatial NR tools are designed to be used in tandem with each other. Temporal NR calculates motion based on neighboring frames and uses that data to detect and subdue noise without affecting the detail or motion in the clip. It's generally less processor intensive and it's suitable for reducing low to medium amounts of noise. Spatial NR analyzes inside the current frame and it reduces the noise in more noisy parts of the image while maintaining detail in other parts of the image. So these controls are more processor intensive, but they're usually used to further reduce noise that the temporal NR controls aren't able to. So the general workflow with these tools is to basically start with temporal NR, and then if you need to, you go to spatial NR to reduce the noise even further. So I'm going to create a new node by hitting Shift S, and I'm going to set this as my first node in my pipeline, and I'm just going to label it NR for noise reduction. So right now we're not applying any noise reduction, and you won't see any change in the footage with the noise reduction until you change the luma and chroma thresholds. So nothing will happen if you don't increase those sliders. So the first dropdown you'll see is frames. And this dropdown determines how many frames on the left and on the right that Resolve uses to average to detect motion and noise in the clip. So if you're setting it to 0 frames, that means it's not looking at any frames and it's just applying a blanket of noise reduction over your clip. If you set it to 5, that means it's looking 5 frames ahead or 5 frames behind, averaging those frames, and then using that information to determine what's actually moving in the clip and what kind of detail is there, and then what's the noise in the clip. So the higher number that you set it to, the more processing power it'll take. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that the more frames you have it look at, the better your results will be. And this is because it's looking at motion in the frame. So if you have something that moves across the frame really quickly, say it moves across the frame within 2 frames or 3 frames, if I use a frame number of 5, that means it might think that some of that movement is actually part of the noise. And so when you choose a higher number, you have a higher likelihood of getting artifacting in moving parts of the image. But typically I usually stay in the range of 2 to 3 unless I have a lot of motion. Then I use something like 1. Between 2 and 3 is kind of a good balance between performance and noise reduction. Next, you're going to see motion estimation type. And this is basically a quality setting for Resolve. Faster means that it's going to use less processing power and you'll get faster results. Better means that it's going to use slightly more processing power, but you're going to get better results. And none means that it's not going to do any motion estimation on your footage. So I wouldn't recommend using none because faster is definitely better than none and it doesn't use that much more. But usually I stick to better because I feel like the trade-off is worth it for a better noise reduction and motion isolation, and it doesn't really have that much of an effect on my system. And then next we have motion range. Motion range is a way to tell Resolve how much motion it should expect in the footage. I typically leave this on medium, but if I have a shot with a lot of movement, you can set it to large, or if you have a shot with not a lot of movement, you can set it to small. All right, so now we're moving on to temporal threshold, and this is actually where you control the amount of noise reduction that's being done on your footage. So if I zoom in here and I increase the luma and chroma, you can see as I increase it, the noise is being reduced. So if I set it to 0, there's none. If I set it to 100, that's the maximum amount of noise reduction being done on the footage. When I use these tools, I always have my parade scopes in view. You always want to adjust these tools with the parade scopes. And this is because as you increase the luma and chroma temporal threshold, you'll see that you can see the noise being reduced in the waveform, and these lines get slightly sharper as you reduce it. So I'm just going to slowly increase the noise, and you can see, looking at the parade scopes, as I increase it, you can see slowly that they're getting a little bit sharper. And if I zoom in here on the green channel, you can see if I set it to 0 and then I slowly increase it, you can see the noise go away in this shot. And the reason that it's pretty subtle is because there's not a whole lot of noise in this image anyways. So I'm just going to increase this to a range where I see the noise disappearing, but I don't go too much further than where it disappears. So you can see that if you increase it too far, you may start to remove detail that you want in the image, or you might introduce artifacts into moving parts of the image. So oftentimes in digital footage, there's more chroma noise than luma noise, or the chroma noise is, more ugly. So in that case, you can actually unlink the threshold and you can increase the chroma slider by itself, and you can see if that does anything. It's okay to see some luma noise, but the chroma noise is what really is kind of ugly. So if you wanted to further reduce the noise, you could always grab the chroma slider and slide it up. So the motion threshold control basically sets the point at which Resolve does not apply any noise reduction to the image. So this tool is kind of linked to the settings that you chose in number of frames and motion range, because you're telling Resolve how far to look and how much to expect. And you can use those tools in tandem with the motion slider to remove any artifacting in moving parts of the image. So if you have a shot with very little motion, you could increase the threshold. And if you have a shot with a lot of movement and motion blur, you could try decreasing the threshold to limit the artifacting in the moving parts of the image. I typically leave this setting at the default of 50 for most shots. And finally, we have blend, which is basically like an opacity setting. So at 0, it's applying the full noise reduction in this tool, and at 100, it's applying none. So this is kind of a way to dissolve it or dial it back. I don't use this tool a lot because I think if I want to dial it back, I'd rather use these tools. I also think that you could waste processing power if you crank all of these settings and then reduce the blend. So I think you're going to get better results keeping the blend at 0. So you can see that these settings are largely determined by the footage that you're working with, and you're trying to strike a balance between the amount of noise that's in the footage, the performance of your computer, and the amount of detail that you want to preserve in the shot. But if you're kind of looking for a go-to setting, this is what I use to start with off the bat in most scenarios. So I set my frames to either 2 or 3, and then motion estimation type, I set it to better. Motion range, medium, unless I have a lot of motion in the footage, I'll set it to large. And then I set my luma and chroma temporal threshold, I link them, and I set them to about 10 and see how that works. And then I leave my motion at 50. From there, I can either increase my luma and chroma depending on how much noise there is, or decrease it if there's not a ton of noise. And I actually kind of like how it smooths out the image. It does a good job on skin tones and stuff like that. So we're gonna work on this clip in a minute, but before we do that, let's just go through the spatial NR settings so we can get a good overview of all of the tools we have at our disposal. So in general, the spatial noise reduction tools are meant to be used once you've maxed out the capabilities of the temporal noise reduction. So first off, we have mode, we have faster, better, and enhanced. And I'm just gonna go right off the bat and say, don't ever use faster. Even at a spatial threshold of even 5, you're gonna start seeing a lot of blurring, a lot of weird stuff going on in your image, and I honestly just don't think faster is worth it. If you're looking to get more noise reduction, I would say go back to your temporal noise reduction and try to max out those settings there, but do not use faster. I don't think it's worth it. So that leaves better and enhanced. And better is significantly better. Like, I think it should actually be labeled best because it's way better than faster. Better is also significantly more processor intensive, but it does a really good job at preserving detail in the image. So if you're using values in the luma and chroma between about 0 and 50, I would go for the mode of better. If you're finding that you need to increase these sliders past 50 in order to get a good amount of noise reduction, I would switch it over to enhanced. And enhanced is another step up from better. It's significantly better, but it really only works well at higher spatial thresholds, so between like 50 and 100. And you're going to find that enhanced does a good job at preserving sharp details or areas of the image with lines or, more fine detail. And it's going to be able to separate the noise from those details. In a worst case scenario with a lot of noise, go for enhanced mode. If not, I would recommend sticking to better. The only downside of better is that when you use it, the luma and chroma threshold sliders are linked together. You can't unlink them. So if you're looking to only adjust the chroma and not as much luma, you're going to be stuck with enhanced because, like I said, definitely don't use faster. All right, so next we have radius, and you can kind of think of this as the radius of the blur or the effect that it's applying to the image. So a small radius is going to be better for lower spatial thresholds. But the downside is that if you have sharp lines, you might see aliasing in those lines. The bigger radius you go, the more processor intensive it's going to be. However, large is good if you're using a high spatial threshold. In general, I would recommend the higher spatial threshold you go, the larger the radius you should go. But in general, I usually leave it on small to medium unless I'm doing an intense amount of noise reduction. And the rest of the tools in this section you're already familiar with. So we have the spatial threshold of luma and chroma, and these sliders control the amount of noise reduction that you need to do in the image, but you'll have to play around and see how it affects your image. And finally, the blend is just another opacity adjustment. So 0 is applying everything, and then 100 is completely turning it off. All right, so now that we've completely done an overview of all of the controls in this effect, let's go through and look at some specific examples on how we can use these tools to reduce the noise in the footage. In this first shot, there is a small amount of noise that we want to reduce, but I also don't want to affect these bricks, and I also don't want to affect any of the cars moving in the background. All right, so the first thing that we want to do when we're doing our noise reduction is we're just going to set our number of frames. And like I said, this is determined by the amount of motion you have in your footage. So for this clip, since we don't have a whole lot of motion, I'm going to set it to 3. Next, I'm going to set the motion estimation type to better. And then our motion range, I'm just going to leave at medium. So the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to take a look at my scopes. And actually, let's make them bigger so we can see. I'm looking at the scopes as they get sharper. So as you can see, as I pull it, you can see that it's getting sharper. And there's a point where if I pull it too far, I'm really not doing anything. And if I zoom out, you can see like the truck in the background is getting blurry, and that's an effect of the frame averaging and the motion range. So if I increase the motion threshold, if I play with this, you can see it affects the truck. So let me zoom in on the background here. And as I increase this, you can see it kind of affects the blur. If we reset this back to 50, this is something that you want to keep an eye out in your footage. Let's zoom back into here, and I'm going to bring this back down. So I'm looking at my parade scopes, increasing it till I feel like it's not doing much anymore. And around that point, I feel like it's pretty good. So this is before, and this is after. Before and after. And then I'm going to zoom out as well. Before, after. And let's play it back. So you can see that when I use 3 frames, better, medium, all of these settings, I'm getting real-time playback and I'm not having to worry about pre-rendering at all. It's playing back in real time and it's nice and smooth. And I feel like these results look really nice and clean. And I can turn back on my color correction and we can play the footage back and it's nice and clean. And we've reduced the noise completely in the image and it's looking good. If I wanted to pre-render this node, I can right click it and set the node cache to on. And then up in playback, I can go to render cache and then set it to user. And the node you'll see turns red, and that means that it is currently rendering that node. And if I turn on my timeline, you can see it's already completed. Now it's blue, that means it's done. But this line up top here shows which frames are cached and which aren't. So if it's totally blue, that means that it's fully rendered. If parts of it are red, that means that it's still rendering those or it's not cached yet. I can scrub through and color grade really easily now, and I don't have to worry about the noise reduction node anymore. From here, we could go to the end of our node tree and we can add some film grain, or we can just leave it clean and we have a nice clean image. All right, so in this next clip, this is a very problematic clip. You'll see that we have a ton of noise in the footage. There's noise in the highlights, midtones, shadows, everywhere in the image. And on our subject right here, you can see that there's noise on his face. And this is what I would call distracting noise. If we don't do anything to it, in my opinion, is pretty much unusable. So for this clip, you can see that I have a basic correction that's bringing up the brightness. And then I also have a color space transform that's converting it from S-Log, S-Gamut3 Cine to Rec 709. And so I'm going to create a new serial node before, and I'm just going to label this noise reduction. Let's just clean up the node graph so it looks nice and clean. Correction and CST. All right, so on our first node, the noise reduction node, we're going to zoom in, and I want to find a frame that has detail that we want to preserve. So we're really looking at his face, and that's kind of the main area that we want to focus on. So let's zoom in here. I'm going to turn off my correction and my CST so we can see all of the detail that we're working with. And the other thing I want to look at is how much motion is in the frame. So we've got some quick motion here that I want to make sure I pay attention to. And the camera is slowly moving right, so that's a little bit of motion. I also want to keep an eye on these blinds in the background, that I'm not reducing too much detail and losing that texture. So let's park it back at that first frame, and I'll zoom in here to his face. So we're going to start on temporal, and then we'll go to spatial. So in temporal, I'm going to set my frames to 3 again and set it to better, motion range, medium. That works as well. And then as I adjust the temporal threshold, I'm going to keep an eye on the parade scopes. And you can see here, this one has a more significant change than the previous one. And you can also see that the shadows have more noise than the highlights. So as I increase this, you can see that the highlights aren't really being affected as much, and then the shadows are where it's really affecting the image. So I'm going to increase this as much as I possibly can until the shadows aren't doing much anymore. And let's say somewhere around there. We can do before and after. And I'm paying attention to the detail in his hair, in his hands, in his arms. And you can also see in his fingers here, which are moving, you can see the motion smoothing happening a little bit. And you can see kind of the edges being less sharp. And so these are the things we want to pay attention to in this footage as we adjust these settings. We're going to play with our motion slider to see if it has any effect. And we want to set it to a setting where we're getting noise reduction, but we're not introducing much smearing into the moving parts of the image. Next, we're going to go to Spatial NR because there's still noise in the image that I want to remove. And I think that the Spatial NR is going to be able to do a good job at that. So in Spatial NR, I'm going to change it to better. And we're going to set our radius to medium because there is some fine detail in the frame that I want to keep. So next we're going to increase our threshold. And let's just go too far and see what it does. If I go all the way, you can see that it's really, getting rid of. I'll turn on the blend just so that we can see this. But so this is before, and this is after applying the spatial threshold. So before and after. And you can see as I adjust that, it's taking the noise out of his face, but we're also losing a lot of detail in this building in the background, and we've lost all of the texture in the blinds. So I'm going to try setting it to enhanced and see what that does, which uses more processing power, but you can see we're gaining back detail. And I want to set it to enhanced because we're using a spatial threshold that's over 50. And we basically want to increase this as far as we can go without making it look unnatural. Let's go a little bit before what's happening when his arm is moving with our spatial threshold between better, looks a little more blurry, and then enhanced. It feels like we're gaining some of that detail back. I might increase this a tiny bit more. And we want to make sure that we're not introducing any artifacting into his arm movement. Let's increase this a tiny bit more. And this is kind of where we're trying to finesse the footage. We're trying to strike that balance. And you can even go back to your temporal threshold and see if you increase that anymore, what it does. And then a good rule of thumb that I like to do is kind of turn back on my corrections and see what's actually happening. And we'll zoom out. And then I'm going to turn off the noise reduction, turn it back on. And I want to mention too that he's already a little bit blurry. He's not perfectly in focus. So I feel like this is actually doing a decent job at finding the noise. Maybe we'll back it off to 75. And then I'm going to set the node cache to on, and we're just going to let this render for a second. So you can see that this takes significantly more time to render, but in my opinion, it's worth it. And with the render cache, once it's finished, then you're good to go. All right, so now we're rendered and we can play it back and we can see what we're working with. So in my opinion, this is actually looking pretty clean. And we're losing a little bit of detail in this building back here, but I can still see detail in the shades in the background. And it doesn't look like we're getting a whole lot of smearing. And I feel like it's doing a pretty good job. The last thing that I could do is actually make a new node after my CST. And we're just going to use this node to sharpen the footage a little bit. So I'm going to go to my sharpening tool, and you want to be really gentle with this, but I feel like it could use a tiny bit of sharpening afterwards. So this is before, and this is after. And it kind of brings back those sharp lines here, the sharp edges, and makes it look a little bit more natural. If I full screen this and play it back, we can see that we're kind of gaining back some of those sharp lines, which helps the effect. So this is before, pretty much unusable. And then this is after. And it's looking really clean, actually. And if I wanted to adjust this image even further, I would actually probably add grain on top of it, because I feel like that kind of simulates sharpness. It simulates detail. And especially if that was the look that we're going for, that's definitely something that you could put on top of this to kind of hide the noise reduction that you did. All right, so I have one more shot that I want to show you. I'm just going to paste from the previous. So I'm going to hit Shift equals, and that's going to bring over all of our adjustments from the previous clip. All right, so I'm just going to do this next clip without talking, and I'm just going to show you kind of my process for playing with it. And if you want to watch it, you can check it out. But sometimes I feel like it's helpful to just watch someone work without talking and having to explain it, and you can just see my process for reducing the noise in this shot. Now you'll see that I actually used another technique in this shot by using the luminance qualifier in order to target which areas of luminance values I want the noise reduction to work on in the image. And basically, I noticed that there's not a whole lot of noise in the brighter parts of this image. It's mostly in the darker parts. And so it's effective to not have to even touch the brighter parts of the image with the noise reduction. So another advanced technique that you can use with the motion effects is you can actually use the spatial noise reduction as kind of a skin smoothing technique. So oftentimes colorists will do beauty work and skin smoothing by creating a power window over someone's face and then using the qualifier to qualify the skin tones, and then decreasing the mid-tone detail or adding a slight blur in order to kind of smooth out the complexion of a subject. But the spatial noise reduction tool is actually great at this because it's analyzing parts of the image that have more noise, and it kind of smooths out those parts of the image while still retaining detail. So a big problem is that if you blur out the face, then you're also blurring out the eyes and the mouth and the nose, and that kind of results in an unnatural, unsharp looking image. But the beauty of the spatial noise reduction is that it's actually analyzing every single frame and it's retaining the details that matter. And then as you increase the threshold, you can actually adjust how much the skin is being smoothed. Finally, another reason I like to use the parade scopes while I'm doing noise reduction is because you can actually analyze the clip and see if there's one individual channel that has more noise than the others. Because you can actually set the noise reduction node to only apply the noise reduction to one channel of the image. And you can do this by right-clicking on the node and then selecting channel and unchecking the boxes for the channels that you don't want to affect. So if I only wanted to denoise the green channel, I could only check the box for channel 2 and then apply the noise reduction to that channel. These are all ways to ensure that you're retaining the most detail as possible while being as gentle as possible on the footage and only taking out the noise and not detail or motion. So hopefully by now you're feeling a lot more confident with these tools, and I hope you can see how powerful they are and how going past just using the temporal threshold sliders can really yield amazing results and results that you probably didn't think were possible inside Resolve. It's a balancing act for sure, and it takes some practice to figure out what settings work best, but I think the results are worth it. I also expect that in years to come, with the advancement of AI and also the advancements of GPUs in computers, I think that these tools will only be getting better and better. I also sell LUTs and video tools through my company LUTco, and you can check those out at lutco.co. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely leave a comment if you have any more questions. I try to answer as many questions as possible. I'll see you in the next one.